Welcome all. Rigorous discussions in four chapters regarding the history of subaltern studies, Dipesh Chakrabarty, and the latest take on Ashish Nandi on what counts as modern, or how modernity came, and how modern or being part of a modern consciousness should navigate the tradition itself, and how critical traditionalism, as Ashish Nandi calls it, his take at Sati, or some horrendous religious systems of the past, and their motives can be justified or maybe challenged, or maybe we have to come to a better understanding of things. So, when the present consciousness, everything can come under question, then we have to enter into the poetics of modernity, as Dipesh Chakrabarty calls it. We are moving further into chapter 4, Khadi and the Political Man. And Dipesh Chakrabarty is saying that our values in public life always a matter of conscious choice. An affirmative response to this question is at least implicit in much that is written on public life and its requirement. I do not, as such, question this assumption. There are good reasons for advocating consciously held values in the practice of public life in any modern country. But this essay, which is a historian's discussion of values in Indian public life, focuses on the phenomenon of the historical survival of shared values, beliefs, and desires in what people do rather than in what they say. It is important to explain this point. India now has a recognizable public life made up of all the ingredients that one would consider standard for the construction of the public sphere: a representative democracy, the rights of free speech, and an active fourth estate. This public life produces in everyday discussions its own interpretive system and categories for measuring its own quality. One such key category, perhaps one of the most frequently used in discussions of Indian political life, is corruption. Like any other moralizing category, corruption has many meanings and associations, both conscious and unconscious. However, my purpose here is not to explore its semantic range. I simply want to begin by identifying a particular semiotics of corruption that for Indian politicians, usually men, has something to do with their bodies. There is a strong Gandhian semiotic that still circulates in Indian public life and marks the public man, the politician, out from others. The most general uniform for the respectable public servant in India is the safari suit. For the politician, however, it has been from the time before independence white khadi, the coarse homespun cotton that Gandhi popularized in the 1920s. Its symbolism, as intended in the official or nationalist rhetoric, is clear. The white of khadi symbolizes the Hindu idea of purity, lack of blemish, pollution. Its coarseness and identification with both simplicity and poverty. Together, they stand for the politician's capacity to renounce his own material well being to make sacrifices, tyag, in the public or national interest. Khadi indicates the person's capacity to serve the country. Gandhi's own gloss on Khadi, provided in 1921, mobilized all these meanings and added, in a characteristic nationalist touch, some essential Indianness as well. I know that many will find it difficult to replace their foreign clothes all at once. In order, therefore, to set the example, I propose to discard at least up to the 31st of October my topi, cap, and vest, and to content myself with only a loin cloth and a chadar, shawl, whenever found necessary for the protection of the body. I consider the renunciation to be also necessary for me as a sign of mourning, and a bare head and a bare body is such a sign in my part of the country. Gandhi also claimed that this divestment aligned him symbolically with the ill clad masses. In so far as the loincloth also spells simplicity, let it represent Indian civilization. Emma Tarlow has quite rightly pointed out that it would be a mistake to assume that there was only one meaning to Khadi and that the meaning was available to every Indian in a transparent way. She adduces many pieces of evidence from the writings of Gandhi and his followers to suggest that there was confusion about, as well as criticism of, the significance of Khadi in Gandhi's own time. Khadi, she argues, worked practically for our nationalist politicians because various kinds and designs of Khadi could be used not only to express different understandings of its meanings but to make social distinctions visible as well. There is a telling and humorous story about this in the history of the nationalist movement in Bengal. The story involves the Bengali novelist Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay and the nationalist leader Sharad Bose and their respective attitudes towards Khadi. When he was a member of the Bengal Provincial Congress Committee, Sharad Bose preferred to wear khadi that was fine, stylish, and easy on the body, while another member of the committee, Anil Boron Roy, wore as a symbol of his devotion to the cause of Swadeshi economic nationalism khadi that was heavier, coarser, and harsher, and hence harder to wear. This difference led to animated exchanges among other members of the committee who were often highly critical of Bosch's sartorial preferences. The story goes that, referring to this differential use of khadi among nationalists of the same rank and using the language of homeopathy, which became popular in Bengali nationalism, Sharat Chandra quipped one day, "You see, we have all different kinds here. A little variety is a good thing." Anil Boron Rai, Anil, is the mother tincture of khadi, while Sharad Bose is 200% dilution. Don't you understand? So today, the joke is different. The attainment of independence and the marginalization of any practice of Gandhian politics have made Khadi less a matter of conscious decision or discussion. While Khadi persists, its meanings have lost the richness of the times of struggle against British rule. It now represents either thoughtless habit or, if the decision to wear khadi is clearly conscious, callous hypocrisy. The image of a political leader from a 1994 issue of the magazine Sunday captures the close association that people now see between the donning of khadi and the illegal acquisition of wealth. It documents something about the routine cynicism with which we now read the khadi that adorns the body of the political man. Thus, khadi, once described by Nehru as the livery of freedom and by Sujan Bean as the fabric of Indian independence, now stands unambiguously for the reserve of its nationalist definition. The khadi clad politician is usually seen today as corrupt, khadi itself as a dead giveaway, as the uniform of the rogue, as something like the hypocritical gesture of one who protests too much. In terms of the semiotic of corruption in modern Indian public life, then there already exists a reading of Khadi, no longer as purity and renunciation, but now as corruption and thievery. Given that bribery is commonplace in Indian public life, this interpretation is more than reasonable, especially considering the pretense in which politicians regularly engage of making public their annual incomes and the value of their estates. Much was made of this after Mrs. Gandhi's death, or of announcing, on the assumption of ministerial office, that they will accept only 1 rupee per month in salary. The hypocrisy of the gesture is only true transparent. Therefore, we cannot contest the semiotic that allows us to interpret khadi as shameless hypocrisy. I agree with that reading, yet it does not explain why khadi, or at least the color white, remains the most visible aspect of a male Indian politician's attire. The question is, why does such a transparently hypocritical gesture persist even today? Why do politicians do that which fools nobody? In other words, if I assume that the hypocrisy of khadi is visible to everybody, then its effective purpose cannot be to deceive people into thinking well of the wearer. What has been read as a transparent gesture of hypocrisy must, then, because of its persistent, be amenable to another reading. I will therefore read the Indian politician's uniform, Khadi, as if it were not meant to convince, as if it were meant possibly unconsciously to serve an entirely different purpose. Let me clarify this point. Of course, it is true that in the same way in which we are always half conscious of things that we do through habit, when a politician wears khadi, he is aware of what he is doing. But just as we do not consciously control all the messages carried by all our actions, the politician wearing khadi is not always aware of all the messages that he is communicating. Consider the Hindu action of worshipping a god or goddess. There are many rituals involved in a puja, worship that has neither literal nor scriptural meaning, yet they are not meaningless even if their meaning cannot be verbalized. And we communicate these meanings when we practice these rituals, even if we are unaware of these meanings and therefore have no control over them. One may view the ritual wearing of khadi by male Indian politicians in a similar manner. Not as conscious and hypocritical, one can, I think, reasonably assume that no one would opt for a course of action that communicates precisely that which he is seeking to hide, but as a series of messages circulating in public life but not intentionally communicated. This can happen only if certain notions about khadi or about politicians wearing white are common and ingrained enough to be in circulation in the public consciousness. In other words, just as one can decode social or cultural convention, reading it as a highly condensed statement of some social ideal, whether consciously held or not, one can in the same way decode the conventional wearing of khadi by politicians by asking what kind of notions about the ideal form of public life, since politics is broadly speaking rules for conducting a society's public life, are embodied in the wearing of khadi. Khadi is my excuse for thinking about alternative constructions of the values of public life, and in particular about ways in which heterogeneous possibilities are both opened up and closed off in the modernity that is the legacy of colonial rule. What is of interest here are alternatives to the kinds of public life that capital, lately multinational capital, has or have helped us think. While speaking of alternatives, I have no as yet unrealized or unrealizable future in mind. We are talking about alternative practices of modernity as they are lived now, at this moment of history. These alternatives, as we imagine them, are not autonomous of or separate from mainstream politics. We can describe them only through an act of reading certain everyday practices constitutive of the mainstream. What makes this exercise legitimate is the fact that existing interpretations of why so many male Indian politicians wear khadi or white are inadequate, as I have already explained. What is argued here is that while khadi may legitimately be read as merely an Indian instance of a problem that is a universal feature of a modern politics, the corrupt politician, its continuous use by men in Indian public life also sustains another reading, one that addresses desires for alternative constructions of the public sphere. Constructions that illustrate the heterogeneity of cultural practices that gives Indian modernity its sense of difference. If there is to be condensed imagination of alternative public life to be read through the khadi clad body, it cannot but be an imagination strongly tied to Gandhian politics. And here, one last word of qualification is in order. Although much of what I discuss could be extended to women active in public life, I contemplate mainly the figure of the male politician. There are two reasons for this. First, although there is a history of women politicians wearing khadi or cotton saris in political life, studying their case would require us to focus more attention on differences in the way in which men and women operate in the Indian political sphere. Second, the majority of Indian dominant politicians are still, alas, men. Although, as will become clear in what follows, a critical part of the argument connects Khadi to an analysis of the cultural location of the middle class male body in the Indian public life under British rule. My expression the body refers to an abstracted generalized body, but the body discussed here is male because an Indian woman could not have used and exposed her body as a symbol in the same way in which Gandhi did. Now, coming to the body of the public man. the colonial context. There is a reason for beginning with the question of the body, for the use of the body was central to the way in which colonialism operated, the British being the first to introduce the idea that the body and character were intimately connected. The Gandhian understanding of Khadi must be placed squarely within the semiotics of the body in British colonial rule in India and the possibilities thus unfolded. Colonial modernity was fundamentally concerned with domination. The British use of the body in constructing a modern public life in India reflected that relation. In creating a public culture based on the theme of radical superiority, however, the British conflated character and physical strength, claiming to have an excess of both, unlike Indians. The idea of character itself, it seems to me, was connected with corruption in late 18th century political thought. It must be remembered that the rapacious practices of the employees of the East India Company in the mid to late 18th century at the time of Lord Clive's bakshish, payment to expedite service, nazar, token tribute, or other kinds of interaction that the British saw as graft were rationalized in England as a result of the enfeebling effect of Indian culture on the character of the Englishman in India. Lord Cornwallis's appointment in the late 1780s as Governor General of Fort Williams in Calcutta was made on the assumption that only blood that was both blue and English was capable of maintaining character in public life. In the face of all temptation to corruption that India offered the European fortune seeker. To evolve soon afterward from this assumption was the colonial doctrine that the English or British body in India must be seen as the seat of such character, and that in such an embodied practice of superiority lay the everyday guarantee of the permanence of British rule. The projection of European physical superiority came to be seen as essential to the exercise of authority in colonial Indian public life. One aspect of this superiority was the assumed greater strength of the male European body. Numerous anecdotes and other kinds of evidence attest to this. Stories of Indians in India being forcibly prevented from sharing with Europeans the same public space, whether a train compartment or the white part of a city, abound in nationalist memories of British rule. They formed a genre of their own in our school books. The whole history of modern physical training in India is rooted in the nationalist construction of modern imperial rule as an experience in direct physical humiliation. The body was thus central to the projection of European political strength in India. The study of history, biography, and literature, forms of modern knowledge introduced early by the British, helped popularize in India the connection between character, the body, and the modern public life. The Hindus had no tradition of writing secular histories, and while the Muslims had the art of historical chronicling, this did not amount to studying history in the post Renaissance sense of that activity. The British introduced this particular imagination and genre of writing to India. The early histories written of India by European missionaries, administrators, and educators were often judgments on the character of old Indian rulers. For reasons of convenience, this process will be illustrated with some examples from the history of Bengal before discussing Gandhi again. That the last independent Nawab of Bengal, Sirajuddaulah, was a venal, corrupt, and profligate character, whose defeat at the hands of the British was therefore a matter of natural justice, was regarded for a long time by Bengali historians, who began by translating European texts as the chief moral lesson of our 18th century history. The consumption and production of modern Bengali literature, first drama and then novels, were deeply influenced by the idea that the function of literature was to reproduce variety in human character. A telling example of this is the 19th century Bengali poet Michael Madhusudan Dutt's attempt to portray heroes in this blank verse epic Meghnad Bodh Kabbo, 1861, an outlandish effort since the Indian epics. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are not centered around the idea of the hero in quite the same way as the major European epics are. As the following quotation from a later Bengali literary critics show, the consumption of the Meghnad Vod Kabbo has also been in terms of appreciation of character. Ram and Lakshmans are two of the noblest figures in Indian mythology, but in Madhusudan's poem, they are utterly devoid of valor and honor. In the Ramayana, Meghnad is killed in the battlefield and in fair fight, but in Madhusudan's poem, he is unarmed and engaged in worship in a temple when Lakshman appears clad in celestial armor and kills him in cold blood. We wonder whether we are reading a heroic or a mock heroic poem. Biography, of course, was another important area of writing that was meant to instill in young Indian men and later women the idea of character. The first attempt to disseminate biographies of eminent public men among Indian or Bengali schoolboys was a book called Jivan Chorit by the 19th century Bengali social reformer Ishwar Vidyasagar, a translation of a popular Victorian text by Robert and William Chambers' exemplary biography. It promoted discipline, the formation of regular habits, punctuality, and obedience. Being a translation of European material, however, it soon gave rise to the criticism that Indian boys needed Indian examples to follow, and a series of attempts by Indian authors to indigenize the field of modern biography soon followed. Finally, there was the question of physical strength, the training of the body to be strong, a subject of increasingly popular in nationalist discourse in the second half of the 19th century. One whose statements inscribed this message into the nationalist memory was the 19th century nationalist Hindu monk Swami Vivekananda, who, as is well known, asserted that young Indian boys would do themselves a service if they concentrated more on playing football, soccer, than on reading the Gita. For the Swami, the absence of physical health was an index of social degradation. As Tapan Raychaudhuri puts it, Vivekananda identified better food as one cause of the Westerners' generally better health. Climate and better living conditions were other contributory factors. But the most important reason, in his understanding, was the practice of late marriage. It explained why in Europe a man was still considered young at 40 and a 50-year-old woman not described as old. By contrast, a Bengali was past his youth at 30. There was, however, a critical difference between British imperial and Indian nationalist understandings of the category character as applied to public life. Whereas the British saw it as something embodied and therefore inherited, a ruling race argument, nationalists saw it as a universal and hence translatable idea, a collection of precepts and technique that could be learned and therefore made into an object of pedagogy. Vidyasagar's Jivan Chorit, for instance, saw nothing problematic in presenting to Indian schoolboys an assortment of characters taken at random from world history. Thus, schools became a critical site for acquiring character. Textbooks, classrooms, playing fields, and gymnasiums became the arenas where character was both discussed and imbibed. The body and Gandhi's destruction of the private. Gandhi's understanding of the body and the public man cannot be discussed in isolation from this colonial dynamic. It is easy to see that his early experiments with meat eating were fundamentally influenced, if not inspired, by a nationalist question that troubled many Asian cultures in the 19th century. Were the Europeans stronger because they are beef? They ate beef? Indeed, so many non European nationalists have asked this question and thereby promoted the eating of beef that one might be tempted to ask, is the cow the worst victim of European imperialism? Gandhi thus records the arguments of a meat eating friend that convinced him to try goat. A wave of reform was sweeping over Rajkot at the time when I first came across this friend. He informed me that many of our teachers were secretly taking meat and wine. He also named many well known people as belonging to the same company, and he explained it thus: we are a weak people because we do not eat meat. The English are able to rule over us because they are meat eaters. You know how hardy I am, and how great a runner too. It is because I am a meat eater. Meat eaters do not have any boils or tumors, or even if they sometimes happen to have any, they heal quickly. Gandhi goes on to quote a doggerel of the Gujarati poet Narmada that was popular amongst us schoolboys. The verse captures the colonial nationalist understanding of the role of the body in construction of political power. Behold the mighty Englishman, he rules the Indian small. Because being a meat eater, he is 5 cubits tall. Many of the colonial, indeed modern, concerns about character, however, were to remain with Gandhi. He accepted and advocated the need for discipline and integrity in public life. Observers have commented on the determination with which he submitted himself to the tyranny of the clock. His management of public money with scrupulous honesty also owes something to modern notions of the public and of the accountability of the public man. His lifelong interest in both public health and civic consciousness also marks him out as quintessentially modern. But the critical move that set him apart from both imperialists and other nationalists was the way in which he eventually came to separate the question of character not so much from the body, as we shall see, as from the issue of sheer physical strength, where the imperialists as well as many of the nationalists had located it. Instead, Gandhi grounded the question of the character of the public man in what we would regard today as the issue of sexuality, in overcoming the power of the senses. This is what gives the Gandhian political body its special charge. Let us summarize the Gandhian argument about the relation between the body and non-violence. Aggression, Gandhi seems to be saying, is inseparably connected to male lust. Gandhi saw female sexuality as passive. Non-violence involves love towards all and depended critically on one's capacity to destroy self-love. One's sexual desires are the core of one's self love. Therefore, nonviolence requires a joyful acceptance of celibacy. Gandhi often made a model for both men and women of the ideals of sacrifice and suffering. Hinduism will remain imperfect as long as men do not accept suffering and withdraw their interest in the pleasures of life. There was, to his mind, a direct relation between this withdrawal from pleasure and Swaraj, self rule, his word for freedom. The conquest of lust is the highest endeavor of a man's or a woman's existence, and without overcoming lust, man cannot hope to rule over self. Without rule over self, there can be no Swaraj. No worker who has not overcome lust can hope to render any genuine service to the cause of the Harijans, Gandhi's name for the so called untouchables. Khadi, cow protection, or village reconstruction. Great causes like this call for spiritual effort or soul force. Soul force comes only through God's grace and never descends upon a man who is a slave to lust. Sexuality forms a complex theme both in Gandhi's life and in descriptions of it, including his own. That Gandhi was haunted by his own sexuality is a point made by many observers, particularly those looking at his life from a psychoanalytic angle. The most famous being, of course, Erik Erikson, and of course, gossip columnists and authors of sensationalist histories have been fascinated by his descriptions of the experiments that he conducted in old age to test his self control. So it is by now a commonplace to find Gandhi obsessed with sexuality. I am not concerned with the clinical accuracy of such assessments, for I am not competent to judge what constitutes obsession. Besides, it is clear from available literature that Gandhi's ideas about sexuality and celibacy were influenced by many different sources. Gandhi's ideas about sexuality and celibacy were influenced by many different sources. There were at work Indian Hindu practices and ideals of asceticism and abstinence, brahmacharya, and of sacrifice, tyag, and other such notions. As Gandhi himself wrote on the technique of fasting in a chapter on brahmacharya in the autobiography, it may be said that extinction of the sexual passion is, as a rule, impossible without fasting, which may be said to be indispensable for the observance of brahmacharya. What I intend to do here is to move away from the question of whether Gandhi's detailed discussion of the problem of his sexuality constitutes, clinically speaking or otherwise, an obsession on his part that is not relevant to my attempt to read in the Gandhian representations of the body a semiotic system of alternative modernity. For the purpose of my analysis, I will read as confessional what is commonly seen as obsessive in Gandhi. Once we do this, we will see in clearer outlines the alternative conceptions of public life that Gandhi articulated and of which Khadi now acts as an extremely condensed statement. Gandhi's is, in fact, the only confessional autobiography ever to be written by a prominent Indian public leader, and it shares much with the tradition of Augustine and Rousseau. Not only does Gandhi adopt from certain monastic strands in Christianity the idea of a universal love that can be fostered only by destroying all traces of self love, sexuality in oneself, but he also uses a Christian confessional technique, central, as Foucault would remind us, to the construction of the modern subject, to narrate himself in the public sphere. His autobiography was written in part to fill the pages of his weekly magazine, Navajivan. One can indeed read his obsessive descriptions of his guilt ridden sexual experiences as so many confessions of his sins. But there remains one very interesting difference between a Christian confessional autobiography and Gandhi's. On this difference hinges a critical part of my argument. A confession, argues William Springsman in discussing Augustine, makes the work of self on self visible to a higher self, an all knowing God. Confessions are narrations of self knowledge addressed to a being who knows everything anyway. Gandhi's confessions are interestingly not called that, rather, they are described as provisional results of ongoing experiments. The addressee of Gandhi's narration, the higher being to whom the work of self on self is being revealed, is thus no all knowing self. The word experiment carrying within itself an inexorable connotation of openness and uncertainty. Gandhi makes it quite clear that God is not the addressee of his autobiography. In this sense, his autobiography is not confessional. There are some things which are known only to oneself and one's maker. He writes, adding, these are clearly incommunicable. The experiments I am about to relate are not as such, but they are spiritual or rather moral. In thus shifting the addressee from the register of Christian godhood, Gandhi converts the confessional into a mere technique and orients it towards the secular engagement, the task of building a modern public life. In so doing, however, he constructs a new modern subject of political and public life, one who has been neither theorized nor deconstructed in European thinking. The gaze that Gandhi invites on himself, the gaze to which he exposes himself, is relentless. Watch me closely was his instruction to those who wanted to study him. He deliberately shunned any idea of privacy. When the anthropologist Nirmal Bose sought his permission to study him close up in the 1940s, Gandhi said, one should actually see me at work and not merely gather from my writings. On another occasion, the instruction was even more forthright. You have drunk all that I have written, but it is necessary that you should observe me at work. I have called you to my side. You must examine it if it was dictated by self interest. Self interest may be of two kinds, one is entirely personal, and the other is in relation to what one stands for. Examine my motives carefully. Gandhi thus shunned the idea of privacy. Sleeping naked and completely asexually with others was one of his experiments in this regard. Nothing in his life was to be hidden from public gaze. Everything was open to observation and narration. Not that there could not be a private Gandhi, but whatever the private man was, it was not for narration to others. Things which are known only to oneself and one's maker are clearly incommunicable. Gandhi marks here the emergence of a modern whose difference from the European or Christian modern is measured precisely by this statement. The interiority of the European modern subject, the interiority that pours out in novels, autobiographies, diaries, and letters, contained within itself a secularized version of what one once confessed to God. The European modern is born on this condition that the private be narratable, and in that sense, the private self of the European exceeds or transcends the body. The European private one might say, is a deferred public. Give it time, and the private of the European becomes available for public consumption in many different forms of narration or representation. The Gandhian private is non narratable and non representable. Not that it does not exist, but it is beyond representation and it dies with the body itself. In one stroke, as it were, Gandhi thus collapsed the distinction between the private and the public on which the theoretical side of the political arrangements of Western modernity rest. Conclusion: the Gandhian modern was thus in a relation of both affinity and tension with the modernity of the citizens of European political theory. With the latter, the Gandhian modern shares a concern for public health, freedom of speech and inquiry, and civic awareness. Yet it does not fulfill the condition of interiority that the discourse of rights both produces and guarantees for the citizen of the modern state. Three lines of tension are easily detected. First, the idea of a completely narratable public life and a completely non narratable private one corresponds to the idea of a completely transparent government. Examine my motives carefully, as Gandhi said. The modern state, however, cannot ever fulfill this requirement. National security, political intelligence, etc., are its watchwords. Second, the moral claim to representation does not go with the idea of politics as a profession. The Mother Teresas are not politicians in our everyday understanding, whereas in Gandhian modernity, such a distinction would be difficult to sustain. Third, the relation between the Gandhian construction of the public sphere and the logic of capital accumulation is not straightforward. For if public life valorizes renunciation as a supreme value, how would one write acquisitiveness into a universal model of the human being? I read the Khadi that adorns the body of the hypocritical Indian politician as a condensed statement of this tension between an untheorized and increasingly unacknowledged subject of colonial modernity, to which I will now apply the collective appellation Gandhi, and the actual rapacity of Indian capitalism. For our capitalist practices promotes values quite the opposite of those that Gandhian politics taught us to desire. Those desires have receded but not disappeared from Indian public life. We do not think about them, but we do, in a manner of speaking, practice them. However, perversely, in our politicians continuing with the collective habit of still supporting Khadi or some metonymic substitute for it. This cultural statement, however, does not belong to the order of intentional or conscious transactions. To read Khadi as a conscious statement of intent can, as mentioned earlier, only lead us to see it as ritualistic and hypocritical. That reading is not invalid, but it carries a post Protestant understanding of rituals as empty. The fallacy here is of the same order as the one that Slavoj Zizek discusses in his The Sublime Object of Ideology. The reduction of ideology to conscious intentions and beliefs. Zizek argues against the idea that a belief is something interior and knowledge something exterior. Rather, he says it is belief which is radically exterior, embodied in the practical, effective procedures of people. The point is repeated in his discussion of the law. Belief, far from being an intimate, purely mental state, is always materialized in our effective social activity. Belief supports the fantasy which regulates social reality. What appears in Zizek as theory may be recognized as a home truth of the Hindu tradition. Within that tradition, the so called rituals have never been empty, for they have always been non subjective and non intentional means of communication. There is thus a question of practiced belief involved in the wearing of khadi. The question is both logically and culturally valid. Although the reduction today of the Gandhian alternative to what looks like an empty ritual is understandable, for the qualities that Gandhi demanded of the public man do not, as I have explained, sit easily with the logic of capital accumulation. The condition of Gandhi's success was colonial rule. The very fact that, except during moments of limited devolution of power, the actual instruments of government belonged to the colonizers allowed Indian nationalists to fabricate for themselves arenas outside the sphere of formal institutional politics that could act as a theatre for the self expression of the Gandhian modern. With the dawn of independence, Indian capitalism and democracy have developed their own distinctive characteristics, different from both the tenets of Gandhian politics and those of European classical writings on either of these phenomena. Yet the survival to this day of the Gandhian uniform, for all the historical mutations that it has undergone, cannot be explained as just an empty or hypocritical ritual. For we would then have to think of the Indian voters as enormously gullible. I have therefore read it as the sight of the desire for an alternative modernity, a desire made possible by the contingencies of British colonial rule, now impossible to realization under the conditions of capitalism, yet circulating insistently within an everyday object of Indian public life, the male politician's uniform. I do not think that Khadi convinces anybody any longer of the Gandhian convictions of the wearer, but if my reading of it has any point to it, then its disappearance, were that to happen, would signify the demise of a deeper structure of desire and would signal India's complete integration into the circuits of global capital. So we have come to an end. So we have more or less discussed the Gandhian stage and pre independence and how modernity or being modern constitutes itself in the passing of time within the chapters of history. We will discuss further in our next episode.